He arrived in Rome almost unnoticed, as though the city, with all its grand basilicas and ancient columns, had no idea that a quiet flame was about to pass through. Cardinals typically enter the eternal city with well-wishers, press photographers, and the swirl of speculation. This time, there was a hush surrounding him, an odd hush for such a beloved figure. In his hand, he carried only a small, battered travel bag, more akin to a pilgrim than a prince of the church. The man was Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle from the Philippines, though if you asked the residents of Manila, many of them would lovingly call him Cardinal Cheeto, the gentle soul who had once walked their slums and city streets and talked to them like they were old friends. Even as he landed on the tarmac, there was no immediate crowd. A few travelers recognized his face. He had, after all, appeared in global Catholic circles, on news segments, at gatherings of the faithful, and they whispered to one another, "Is that Tagle? He looks so humble in person." A random bystander stepped forward to greet him, fumbling with words, "Eminence, I'm honored to meet you," only to be met with a warm handshake and a quiet laugh as though they were dear companions. "I'm just grateful to be here," Tagle would say. You could see in that moment that the handshake was no formality. It was an embrace of hearts. The bystander later told a friend that Cardinal Tagle looked right into his eyes as though they'd known each other forever. In the days to come, Rome would fill with whispers, overshadowed by a bigger event, the papal conclave of 2025. The entire Catholic world was anxious, perched on the edge of wonder about who might become the next pope. Pundits, journalists, and social media commentators compiled their shortlists, those with the most influence or the strongest voices on pressing issues. And yes, Tagle's name featured prominently. Some favored him for his gentle presence, his multinational perspective, his capacity to speak softly yet touch hearts deeply. Others were uncertain because, as many Vatican insiders observed, he was not known for seeking power. That alone both intrigued and perplexed them. When the cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel, under the frescoes that have gazed upon centuries of tradition, Tagle found his seat with unforced calm. The first few scrutinies came and went. The ballots piled up, names were counted, speculation grew. Each time Tagle's name was read aloud in the results, an unease seemed to ripple through the watchers in the press. Some said he was too straightforward, too vulnerable. Others said that was exactly what the church needed. When it became clear that Tagle might not have the majority to become pope, the man himself showed no disappointment. Observers noticed instead a deep peace on his face, something akin to acceptance that he was here to serve, not to seize. A few cardinals would later recount glimpses of him in the corner, hands clasped together, eyes closed in humble prayer. Then came the surprise. The ballots tilted in favor of a cardinal very few had predicted, the one who would take the name Pope Leo XIV. No one had pegged him as a frontrunner. He had arrived with the same quiet air that marked Tagle's presence. The masses watching outside in St. Peter's Square were first stunned, then cautiously intrigued. Journalists raced to craft their narratives. A pope of discernment, the silent shepherd, an unpredicted pontiff. Meanwhile, in the moment that Pope Leo XIV's name was announced within the chapel, Cardinal Tagle was seen gently bowing his head, tears sliding down his cheeks. One cardinal, who dared to place a hand on Tagle's shoulder, whispered, "It's all right, Luis. The Spirit guides," only to realize that Tagle's tears did not flow from disappointment or bitterness, but from an overwhelming love for the church and a sense of awe at the weight now placed on another's shoulders. Those tears would soon become a point of quiet conversation among the cardinals and an emblem of what Tagle represented. "He weeps not for himself," Pope Leo XIV would say in a private conversation months later, "but for the burden the rest of us must carry." The conclave ended, white smoke rose, and the world turned its eyes to a new pope. The usual excitement overtook the city, but Tagle seemed to slip into the background. Perhaps it was an almost deliberate choice on his part. He returned to simple pastoral work, celebrating masses in smaller chapels, visiting local communities, performing spiritual retreats far from the glare of the media. Some journalists who had championed his cause for the papacy lamented, "He's disappeared," while others noted, "It's typical of Tagle to avoid the limelight." In the months following, Pope Leo XIV did not rearrange the Vatican hierarchy with sweeping changes. He didn't rush to hold major synods or release controversial encyclicals. He governed through a profound stillness that baffled the usual analysts. Some commentators insisted it was a sign of indecisiveness. They wanted bold action, crisp statements, strong policy moves. But those within the papal circle, especially those who had come to understand the new pope's heart, realized it was not inaction but discernment. He prayed deeply, met people face to face, listened in extended silences that sometimes made seasoned Vatican bureaucrats squirm. He seemed to hold every suggestion, every question, in a prayerful space before responding, often days or even weeks later. Rumors arose. He's going to reorganize everything. He's going to name unexpected cardinals. He's going to end all internal factions. Yet outwardly, not much changed. The deeper shifts, as some discovered, were happening in the hearts of those who encountered him. One day, a close papal aide gingerly brought up Cardinal Tagle's name to Pope Leo XIV. "Holy Father, I thought you might like to know how he's doing." The aide showed him some glimpses of Tagle's recent activity: a humble spiritual retreat in a local parish, a prayer vigil with a small group of Filipino migrant workers, a quiet encounter with an interfaith community in the outskirts of Rome. The Pope's eyes lit up as he listened. "Tell me more," he said. The aide described how Tagle was never seeking recognition, how he arrived unannounced, prayed with people in dark corners of a neglected chapel, or shared a simple meal with folks who had no clue that a cardinal was among them. The Holy Father sat quietly, nodded, then said, "He's still weeping, isn't he?" The aide paused, uncertain whether to interpret the question literally or metaphorically, then replied, "Yes, Holy Father. I believe so," but never for himself. Something shifted in Pope Leo XIV's heart that day. He began spending more time in prayer, and each time he contemplated how to move the church forward, how to awaken her missionary fervor, one face would come to his mind, that of Tagle, tear-streaked yet serene. He recalled the moment during the conclave when Tagle had spoken softly among a small group of cardinals, articulating his dream for a church that smells like her sheep, that doesn't barricade itself in fancy structures, but walks among the wounded, the poor, the lonely, the lost. The Pope remembered Tagle's voice quivering with emotion as he described the global tragedies and injustices. The man wore his heart so openly, it was impossible for others not to feel the heartbreak he carried. "We must not be afraid to weep with them," Tagle had said, "for even our Lord wept." Pope Leo XIV began discerning. Few official announcements were made, but in the corridors of the Apostolic Palace, one could sense the Pope was on the cusp of something new. He spoke even less in formal meetings, but he listened more intently, especially to those who had spent time on the peripheries, missionaries returning from distant lands, priests from overlooked parishes, lay people who had launched small initiatives for the homeless. And each time, Tagle's name came up, albeit in whispers. He visited us too. He knelt on the dirt floor. He cried with the families. He just listened. Finally, a small notice appeared in the official Vatican bulletin one morning. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle had been entrusted with a new mission. That was all it said. No clarifications, no grand ceremonies, no press statements. Just a single phrase that left many guessing. Was he being appointed to a new dicastery? Was he being positioned for something official, like an oversight role or a prestigious Vatican department? Media outlets speculated feverishly, but details were sparse. Vatican insiders were equally in the dark, though a few well-placed sources whispered that the Pope wanted to revive the Church's missionary heart, and that Tagle was at the center of it. Someone overheard a comment from one of Pope Leo XIV's closest confidants. He doesn't want just to reorganize a structure. He wants to reignite a fire. When Cardinal Tagle received the news personally from Pope Leo XIV, it was a private meeting. No cameras were rolling, no official transcripts. According to someone who later heard Tagle's recollection, it was almost heartbreakingly simple. The Pope invited Tagle to sit, served him tea, and said, "I don't bring you a title, Luis. I bring you a mission. Are you willing?" Tagle nodded and responded, "Wherever I'm needed, Holy Father, even if it's the smallest corner." The Pope explained that countless people were leaving the church or had grown indifferent, not because they hated God, but because they no longer recognized his image in those who claimed to serve him. The world was fractured, wounded, and people were yearning for shepherds who would cry, kneel, and remain near in the darkness. "I believe you have that shepherd's heart," the Pope said. "Please share it." What exactly the mission entailed was not spelled out in that conversation. Pope Leo XIV simply suggested, "We will shape it together, step by step. You go, listen, pray with them. Let them see our tears. Let them see where they're not to fix from above, but to walk with them. We'll figure out the rest as it unfolds." Tagle left that room with a sense of awe and maybe a renewed trembling. He was not a mere functionary. He was, in a sense, being sent like an apostle. No fanfare, no medals, just the unspoken charge to be there. Later that day, Tagle wrote a brief message to a friend. He asked me to go out. "I only hope my feet are steady and my tears stay true." That friend passed the note to someone else, and soon the rumor spread. Tagle had become a missionary in the fullest sense, but with no official name for it. He began quietly. His first act was to visit a small parish in the Trastevere neighborhood of Rome, where a young priest was visibly exhausted, uncertain how to bring life to a dwindling congregation. Tagle listened to him for hours, nodding, asking gentle questions. The young priest recalled later that Tagle had said only one clear directive: keep the doors open, even when no one comes. Especially then. Something about that short exhortation changed the priest's perspective. He realized it wasn't about numbers, but about presence. He started sitting in an open confessional late into the evening, just in case someone wandered in. Eventually, the homeless around the neighborhood began stepping inside, drawn not by some grand program, but by the warmth they sensed. Word got around that Tagle had visited, but the cardinal himself had already moved on. From Rome, he traveled, often unnoticed, to various corners of the world. He appeared in North Africa, where a small community of Christians faced isolation, in a small parish in Poland, grappling with disillusioned youth, in Argentina, where economic struggles weighed heavily on families, in Cameroon and Colombia, where violence and fear had left deep scars, in Slovakia, Nigeria, Eastern Europe, Canada, Brazil, Japan, India. The list kept growing. Wherever Tagle went, he had no press entourage. People found out he was there only when they glimpsed a photograph someone snapped on a phone or heard a story from friend of friend. He was with us. We told him our stories. He cried. Indeed, the tears continued. Some might find it strange for a church leader to weep so often, wondering if it was mere theatrics. But those who met Tagle sensed the raw sincerity in each tear. When a mother in a war-torn area spoke of her child lost to violence, Tagle's eyes watered not as a matter of pity, but genuine heartbreak. When a father in the slums of Manila described feeling worthless because he couldn't provide enough food, Tagle's tears spoke louder than any sermon on God's providence. When a teenager in Eastern Europe confessed to feeling completely abandoned by both family and church, Tagle's tears bridged a connection that words alone might never have built. "This is a wordless gospel," one local pastor observed. "He preaches by letting his heart break with ours." Tagle offered a simple explanation. You cannot preach until you have cried, and you cannot cry unless you have listened. Many young priests who encountered him tried to grasp the theology behind it. He told them, half jokingly, "If you go an entire year without tears, you're probably holding back something important from God and your people." His was a theology of presence, a conviction that evangelization was first about being with people where they hurt and rejoice. Marketing strategies and big campaigns had their place, but Tagle insisted that the real mission was incarnational, stepping into others' stories as Christ stepped into ours. One particularly moving episode occurred in Lisbon, where a large gathering of youth from various backgrounds took place. The event was meant to be a typical Catholic conference with songs, testimonies, and a big stage. But Tagle sidestepped the main spotlight and spent time with a group of refugees who had traveled there with hopeful hearts but carried the trauma of displacement. Those refugees did not expect a cardinal to approach them. They spoke little English, some spoke Arabic, others had different tongues. Tagle surprised them by greeting them in fluent Arabic, a language he had learned years prior in the interest of interfaith dialogue. The refugees were stunned. "He speaks our language," one of them said tearfully. "He's not just dropping in with a translator. He learned it himself." A young volunteer described the moment as another Pentecost because Tagle bridged a seemingly impossible gap. Afterward, local priests felt inspired to learn basic phrases in the languages of their migrant communities, realizing how powerful it is to speak to people in their mother tongue. In France, where secularization had made deep inroads, Tagle again traveled quietly, meeting with parish councils and youth leaders. He didn't deliver fiery homilies or scolding lectures on returning to faith. Instead, he led them in a moment of silent prayer, so deep that many found themselves uncomfortable at first. He knelt with them in an empty church hall, inviting them to be still and let God's whisper speak. Over time, those who participated reported a sense of renewed calm, describing it as a silence that felt like God was finally given room to talk. Some younger Catholics said that, contrary to their assumptions, they discovered a kind of intimacy with God that had been drowned out by endless noise. Tagle told them, "Silence is where love can speak without words, and love is the loudest voice in the end." In Lourdes, among the throngs of pilgrims and the sick seeking healing at the famous grotto, Tagle noticed an elderly woman who had dropped her rosary, scattering beads along the ground. She tried to pick them up, her hands shaking. Before anyone else could rush in, Tagle was already on his knees, collecting each bead. Realizing the chain was broken, he carefully pulled a length of twine from his pocket. He kept such things precisely for these little acts of repair, threaded the beads, and tied a makeshift knot to secure them. The elderly woman apologized repeatedly for the trouble, but Tagle responded, "Today the rosary prayed for you." Love can always restore what is broken. This small encounter spread among pilgrims. People marveled at the cardinal who not only helped but also used something as simple as twine, as though symbolic of how God can mend our lives using ordinary threads of grace. Soon, others started picking up broken rosaries and fixing them for fellow pilgrims, turning it into a sort of communal act of compassion. Wherever Tagle went, he made sure to seek out the elderly. He was convinced they were not outdated relics, but living archives of grace. They are prophets, he would say, carrying memories of faith across generations, transforming their own pain into wisdom. In one retirement home, Tagle spent hours listening to an old man who had survived multiple wars and had lost his family to conflict. Tagle wept with him, prayed a silent prayer, and thanked him for keeping the flame of faith alive. Observers said it was like a grandson coming back to learn from a grandparent, not an eminent cardinal bestowing blessings. "He helps us see the dignity in our wrinkles," said an elderly nun. "He kneels before time, as though time itself were a sacrament." In the slums of Kolkata, India, he spent nights sleeping in a simple cot among families living in one-room shacks. He helped distribute food, but more than that, he listened to them speak of daily struggles, from health crises to lack of education. "We're teachers for you, Cardinal," one mother asked incredulously when Tagle told her the church had much to learn from them. "Yes," he nodded firmly. "You know how to survive in solidarity. You share the little you have. You keep hope. These are lessons heaven wants us to learn." Some theological students from a local seminary joined him the next day, and Tagle told them, "Your theology is incomplete until you've seen the face of Christ in these alleys. Let the poor evangelize you." Reports of Cardinal Tagle's travels circulated through unofficial channels, photos posted on social media, testimonies shared by local pastors, short videos taken on cell phones. There was a distinct pattern emerging, a renewed sense of mission in every place he visited, but not because he was imposing a grand plan. Rather, he was igniting hearts by being present, a presence that reminded people of Christ's own tenderness. Priests and bishops started to reflect on their own approach. Some decided to spend more time listening to their congregations instead of rushing from one administrative task to the next. Others formed listening circles, encouraging parishioners to come and share their burdens openly. Laity, too, felt inspired. If a cardinal can go out and sit with the homeless, we can do the same in our neighborhoods, said a group of young volunteers in Madrid. We don't need a grand church program to love people. Over time, the stories multiplied. In Brazil, Tagle visited an indigenous community struggling to preserve their land and culture, praying with them at the edge of a forest threatened by deforestation. He spoke softly. God is with you in this forest. He made this land. If we do not learn to love it, we are losing a part of ourselves. In Canada, he spent time in an urban center where mental health issues and addiction plagued a large homeless population. He joined a team of volunteers distributing blankets on a cold winter's night. A local volunteer described how Tagle would pause with each person, ask their name, and listen without hurry. That same volunteer said, "He told me that sometimes our greatest gift is the time we do not watch." Each journey was punctuated by the same routine. At the end of the day, Tagle would find a small chapel or a quiet corner to spend hours in Eucharistic adoration. People who saw him there recounted how he appeared lost in a conversation deeper than words, sometimes wiping tears even in the silent presence of the Lord he adored. One observer recalled seeing him in a humble chapel after midnight, illuminated only by the flickering sanctuary lamp, murmuring prayers. It seemed that was where Tagle found the energy to continue, in communion with the one who had first wept over humanity. After many months, possibly years, of this constant traveling and quiet ministering, Tagle returned to Rome. Word got ahead of him. He could not remain entirely incognito anymore. When he arrived, there were a few groups of faithful, both lay and religious, waiting to greet him, including some from the communities he had visited around the world. They embraced him and shared stories of how things had changed after his departure, how parishes had started feeding programs for the poor, how youth groups had become more active, how entire neighborhoods felt a spark of hope. But Tagle simply responded that everything good was a gift from God, and he had merely witnessed it. The next morning, Pope Leo XIV invited Tagle for breakfast in a small garden within the Vatican, away from official halls. Over fresh bread, fruit, and coffee, the Pope looked at Tagle with an expression that held both gratitude and wonder. "You're no longer on the margins, Luis," he said. "The margins have returned to the heart, and so have you." He explained that while he had hoped Tagle might return with insights from the people, the Cardinal had brought back far more than that. He had brought the Holy Spirit's gentle reawakening, quietly proving that the Church's real strength was in simply being near to those often overlooked. "You gave them what they needed," the Pope added, "but perhaps more importantly, they gave us what we forgot we needed." Tagle, slightly overwhelmed, expressed that all he had done was respond to the mission entrusted to him. He had not orchestrated a program, nor designed a blueprint. "I just walked, listened, and sat with them," Tagle said, his voice trembling with humility. The Pope looked at him, eyes moist, and whispered, "That is what was needed all along." They ate the rest of their meal mostly in silence, a companionable silence that resembled old friends who no longer needed many words. By then, the significance of Tagle's quiet journeys was undeniable. It had catalyzed a fresh understanding of mission, not one marked by headlines, but by hearts set ablaze through genuine encounter. That afternoon, Tagle returned to his old room in Rome, the same room he had left so many months before when everything seemed uncertain about his future. Some assumed he'd been sidelined, that he was a relic of a dream that didn't come true at the conclave. Now, stepping back inside, he felt no regret, no bitterness. Instead, he recalled the months, perhaps years, he had spent in quiet service, discovering that God works in hidden, small, faithful gestures. Opening his journal, he wrote down a single line: "God does not ask me to be loud. He asks me to be light." He soon found himself invited to speak before a group of seminarians and young priests. They hoped he would impart some theological brilliance or administrative skill for building parishes, but instead he told stories of the people he had met. He recounted how a father in Nigeria clung to faith despite losing everything in a local conflict, how an elderly grandmother in Poland still prayed the rosary with battered beads she had used for decades, how a group of young men in Argentina had turned away from violence after discovering the church was a place they could be heard without judgment. He told the seminarians, "If you haven't learned to sit in silence with the wounded, to cry with them, to speak their language, then all your training will be incomplete. The gospel is not a product to sell. It's a life to share." One seminarian bravely asked, "Your Eminence, do you feel vindicated now that the Pope has entrusted you with such a mission?" Tagle paused, then smiled, a gentle, almost amused expression crossing his features. "Vindication belongs to God alone. All I've ever wanted was to be a priest who loves, listens, and serves. If people see Christ through that, then that's the fruit of grace, not my success." The seminarian later recounted that he felt Tagle's words pierce him with conviction, as though the cardinal was cautioning them against the lure of recognition or the hunger for positions of authority. What transpired throughout the church as a result of Tagle's mission was not a top-down reform in the typical sense. There were no official decrees mandating that every parish create new programs or sign up for mandatory tiers. Instead, something subtle but profound shifted in pastoral priorities. Bishops began encouraging their priests to spend more time in genuine conversation with their flocks, especially the marginalized and those who felt alienated. Lay groups launched new initiatives to accompany the elderly, to fix broken rosaries and fix broken hearts, to learn the languages of refugees in their communities. People rediscovered the simplicity of prayerful silence and realized that evangelization could be as straightforward as sitting beside someone who suffers. In the broader Catholic world, Pope Leo XIV quietly cheered this renewal. He didn't posture or proclaim it loudly. He simply recognized that a seed had been planted, and it was beginning to grow in unexpected ways. In a private meeting with a group of Vatican officials who wondered whether more formal changes were needed, the Pope reportedly smiled and said, "We do not need another structure right now. We need more witnesses. The rest will come in due time." Eventually, journalists picked up on the quieter revolution stirring within the church. They wrote articles titled "The Priesthood of Tears, a Mission of Listening," or Tagle's Silent Revival. They tried to interview Tagle directly to get some sensational story, but he usually deflected the attention. If pressed, he would simply talk about the people he had met, shining the spotlight on them instead of himself. He insisted that the real heroes of the faith were those carrying crosses daily: single parents, abandoned elderly, refugees, or those plagued by addictions. People who remained courageous in darkness, teaching the rest of the church what it truly means to hunger and thirst for God's justice and mercy. Amid all this, Pope Leo XIV remained a figure of contemplative leadership. He continued to guide the church in prayer, resisting outside pressures to move quickly on controversies. Some critics still found him lacking in decisive governance, but supporters realized he was orchestrating a deeper transformation from within, anchored by the kind of missionary zeal that Tagle embodied. "We must move at the speed of God's love," the Pope once remarked, "which is both infinite and intimate, slow to others' eyes but sure in the hearts of those who believe." In time, Cardinal Tagle's journeys became almost legendary, though he himself never considered them extraordinary. To him, they were simply an extension of his priesthood, an invitation to be Christ's tears in the world. He spoke to new priests about how tears could water seeds of faith in barren hearts, that tears, when genuine, were a form of prayer powerful enough to soften the hardest soul. He pointed them to the gospel passage, "Jesus wept," emphasizing it was the shortest yet one of the most profound verses, a testament that God is not distant, but intimately involved in our suffering. The phenomenon was not confined within the Catholic Church. People from other Christian traditions, other faiths, and even non-believers found something universal in Tagle's approach. A journalist of no religious affiliation once wrote, "I am unsure if I believe in God, but I believe in the sincerity of a man who cries for others." Interfaith leaders in places where Tagle had visited remarked that he possessed a rare ability to honor each person's dignity without forcing his beliefs upon them. "He's a missionary," one imam observed, "but he's not imposing. He's simply revealing compassion, which speaks to all of us." In the final analysis, the mission entrusted to Tagle was never about him. It was about reintroducing the world to a church that kneels beside those who hurt, that mends broken rosaries with a simple knot of twine, that learns the language of the displaced, that stays quietly in prayer with a single mother at wit's end. It was about a church that, in weeping with the wounded, finds the wells of living water still present in every broken place. And that, after all, might be the essence of true evangelization, carrying Christ's presence without fanfare, trusting that love itself is compelling enough. As months turned into years, Tagle continued in his quiet pattern. Sometimes he was spotted in a remote village, sometimes in a bustling city, always listening, always prepared to shed tears of compassion. The cumulative effect was a tapestry of renewed faith communities, small but impactful transformations. People who once felt far from God or the church found their way back through personal encounters with a cardinal who made them feel seen, loved, and not alone. Eventually, some asked Tagle if he thought he would ever be called to a higher office. They whispered about the possibility of him being a pope in the future, though such talk seemed far off given Pope Leo XIV's relatively young age and robust health. Each time the question arose, Tagle waved it aside with a gentle laugh, reminding them that leadership in the church is never about climbing a ladder, but about descending into service. "If the church calls, we say yes. If not, we remain faithful," he would remark. A reporter pressed him once, "But didn't you almost become pope?" Tagle responded simply, "There is no almost in God's plan. There is only what is, and what is always enough." And so the final note of this ongoing story is not a coronation or an award ceremony, but the image of a cardinal returning to a small adoration chapel late at night. Kneeling before the blessed sacrament, he speaks no words, only gazes upon the mystery of a God who once chose to weep among us. Outside the chapel, a few faithful linger, some of whom can sense a tangible warmth coming from within. "That's Cardinal Tagle," one whispers to another. "He came back." The other nods. "Yes, he never really left. And even if he did, he'd find us again." This news, this living, unfolding narrative, illuminates a church on a journey of rediscovery, guided by a pope who discerns in silence and a cardinal who weeps in solidarity. It is not the usual headline-grabbing story. It thrives in corners, in hushed chapels, in slums, in the gentle hum of a confessional opened late into the evening. It breathes in the margins that have now, somehow, become central again. Families speak of it around their dinner tables. "Have you heard what the cardinal did in that little village?" Priests whisper about it in their rectories. "Maybe we should try that approach." Just listen. Seminarians carry it in their hearts, longing to be priests who smell like their sheep and cry like their Lord. The elderly treasure it as a sign that they are not forgotten, while the young embrace it as a testament that faith can still be vibrant, authentic, and deeply human. In a world plagued by noise, cynicism, and division, these quiet tears and silent prayers become, strangely enough, powerful instruments of renewal. The Church rediscovers her missionary zeal, not by reorganizing committees or releasing carefully worded documents, but by letting love mark every step. "You can't preach until you have cried." Tagle's words echo. And that cry, that willingness to be vulnerable, to stand beside others in their darkness, forms the heart of a renewed missionary fire. People see a reflection of themselves in the tears of shepherd who is not afraid to weep for the flock. If one were to place a microphone in front of Cardinal Tagle and ask for a final statement on all that has happened, he might say something like, "We are here to be with, not to rule over." Christ shows us how God lowers himself to raise us up. Every time we kneel to listen or weep with someone, we are reflecting just a sliver of that divine love. And if you look closer, you might catch a tear on his cheek as he smiles with gratitude that the church is, step by step, rediscovering her heart. Perhaps that is enough for now. A church returning to the heart of her mission, guided by quiet tears and unwavering presence. No glamorous fanfare, no triumphant orchestrations, just small acts of kindness and deep wells of compassion that ripple across the globe. In these ripples, the grace of God moves freely, touching each life, binding each wound. Pope Leo XIV continues to listen in prayer, trusting that the seeds of renewal will sprout in due time. Cardinal Tagle continues his pilgrimage of presence, trusting that every tear sown in compassion yields a harvest of hope. And we, the faithful, the watchers, or even the skeptics, wherever we find ourselves, cannot help but be moved by the simplicity of it all. In a news cycle that often highlights the sensational, we find ourselves unexpectedly captivated by a story that refuses to shout. It simply presents us with a cardinal who does not mind being overshadowed, a pope who leads from his knees, and countless souls discovering that God is found most profoundly in the space where tears meet prayer. Let this stand as a living testament to a church longing to be more Christ-like. Open doors in a forgotten parish, a broken rosary mended by a piece of twine, a compassionate glance in a refugee camp, a father's tears turned into prayer. Each moment is small, but each carries the presence of heaven. And so, the mission goes on, one hush, one tear, one wordless embrace at a time, rekindling in the church what institutional strategies could never fully accomplish. It is, in the end, the power of becoming human together, wrapped in God's own compassion, that reveals the deepest form of evangelization. We can only watch, and perhaps shed our own tears of wonder.